This is a presentation about Deep Blue. Deep Blue was a combination hardware-software platform that in 1996 played a match against the current, probably strongest chess player in the world, Garry Kasparov. There was a rematch in 1997. Deep Blue lost the first match and won the second match. But before we talk about Deep Blue specifically, we're just going to kind of talk about chess in general for a little bit. So in the game of chess, we won't really cover the individual moves or pieces for the sake of time, but a player is going to win or draw or lose a game. And in a standard professional tournament, you're going to get 1 point for winning a game, and you'll get half a point for drawing and 0 points for losing. So chess is kind of managed by an international organization called FIDE. There are also national chess societies as well. For example, there's one in the United States. But FIDE is the primary international organization for regulating professional chess. And this brings up a kind of interesting wrinkle in the story. And so I mentioned something earlier about Garry Kasparov being probably the strongest player in the world at the time. He was a world chess champion, but not necessarily the only world chess champion. And that's because a few years earlier, Kasparov split away from FIDE and formed his own chess organization because he wasn't happy with FIDE for some reason. So technically there were two world chess champions at the time, but Kasparov was essentially considered to be the strongest chess player in the world anyway, so this match was still a historic match. And it's also worth noting that some years after this, the split was resolved, so FIDE is now the only international large organization regulating chess. So moving beyond that, professional chess is pretty much always timed. There are several time categories. So first of all, in standard tournament chess, there might be, say, 9 rounds in a tournament or more. One round happens on one day, and a standard chess game might last for hours. You know, it might last for 2 hours if it's extremely short. Often the players draw in a scenario like that. Might last 5 hours, might last 7 or 8 hours, at which point the players are going to be terribly exhausted. But yeah, it's a fairly long process. And actually in a tournament, often they'll take a rest day, maybe multiple rest days, to help players recuperate from all the intensive mental exercise that is involved here. There are some faster categories though. So in rapid chess, a player might have 15 minutes for the entire game with an increment, which means that each time the player makes a move, they gain a few seconds on their clock. And then there's blitz chess, in which you have 3 minutes for the entire game in general, again with an increment. And there are other time formats as well, but these are fairly standard. So just kind of continuing, based on a player's performance, they are assigned an ELO rating. And that's based on how they win, lose, or draw against other rated players. A beginner might have a rating below 1,000. Most players, despite how hard they work, are really not going to rise far above 2,000. So, you know, if you were to start now as an undergraduate student and learn chess and really, really work terribly hard at it, you'll probably not get far above 2,000, even if you get to the 2,000 point. And that's because the top chess players in the world, who have ratings above 2,700, start learning chess very young, and they train intensively at a young age. So part of what makes them so good is that as they were developing as a child, they were playing chess intensively. So the very best players occasionally top 2,800, but generally don't stay there. The only real exception is the current world champion, and that's Magnus Carlsen, and his rating has been over 2,800 for many years now, but that's unusual. So when humans are playing chess, there are various things that kind of factor into a good player playing chess. So first of all, there are standard game positions. So there are standard openings, and these are essentially predetermined move sequences that are played at the beginning of a game. Often the standard openings might have, say, anywhere from 5 moves up to 10 or 15. Actually, I would say, you know, the 15 move openings are probably elaborations on a standard opening in many cases. And one of the interesting things about chess openings, and we'll come back to this later, but whenever chess players are playing in a tournament, they'll often blitz out the moves in the opening very quickly. So, a game of chess might start with the first 15 moves for each player being played within just like a handful of minutes. And by 5 minutes, you might be 20 moves into the game. That may be a little bit of an exception. They don't always prepare their lines that deep, but you can have quite a few moves played within a very short period of time at the beginning. And the reason you can do that is because the players spend a lot of time preparing before the tournament. And they use computers actually to help them a lot these days. And they'll calculate positions and figure out what are good moves, what are promising moves, what moves might give you an advantage later in the game. And they come to the game with all of this prepared. They can do this because players tend to specialize in specific opening styles. I don't think that really computer chess engines would do this, but humans do this. And so you kind of know what sort of thing your opponent will do in certain situations, so you can prepare for a specific opponent. And Kasparov wanted to be able to prepare for Deep Blue, but unfortunately he wasn't really able to, and part of that was because of the way Deep Blue was designed. More standard positions include endgames. This isn't necessarily so much always the exact same setup as it is just the fact that once you have a very limited number of pieces on the board, specific pieces for each player, you kind of know certain strategies you're going to be implementing in these positions because they've been achieved so commonly that it's pretty obvious what you're going to be doing if you're a great player. And then there are also traps, and these are positions where there might be a tempting move for your opponent to make, but the move is actually a blunder and it'll lead to them losing material or obtaining a bad position or just losing the entire game. So beyond the standard positions, there's also just general chess strategy. And strategy isn't necessarily concerned with capturing a lot of pieces, although that might be a result of it. But it's often concerned with just getting a favorable position on the board. So that's concerned with positioning your pieces advantageously, maybe reserving a lot of board space for yourself and restricting the movement of your opponent's pieces. And also, because each chess piece moves differently, you might want to optimize the positioning of your pieces so that they can each move in the best way possible given the restrictions in their movement. Then there's tactics. And tactics are often concerned with obtaining material from your opponent, although they can also be concerned with just getting a better position. And tactics are a forced series of moves. So that means with best play by your opponent, you're still guaranteed to get some advantage out of it. And that's with best play, and opponents often don't use best play, which means you'll get even more. So humans can also think several moves ahead. So in some positions, a very good chess player might possibly be able to calculate more than 10 moves ahead. They obviously aren't going to be able to calculate every possible move that far. I mean, we've looked at Minimax earlier a few weeks ago, and you realize that I think when I was running the full Minimax algorithm, I could run it to a depth of 4 and it would take over 30 minutes. So, and that was in a somewhat endish game position. So a very good chess player can't do that. However, they can recognize promising moves and calculate those to a depth of perhaps 10 moves. And the best players can do maybe even more than that. I believe the current world champion claims he can calculate perhaps a depth of 15 to 20 moves in some situations. Then there's memory. So chess players memorize many famous games. And they also sort of memorize position types. So they realize that in certain general categories of positions, you might want to make certain kinds of moves. So that's kind of a place where memory comes in. And then there's pruning, and this comes back to the thinking several moves ahead thing. So obviously you can't calculate 10 moves ahead for every possible move. So some moves you just don't consider. That's because they lead to a bad position. You might lose material. You might just lose the game. You might be checkmated, or you might be forced into a position where you just feel the only thing you can do is resign. And this is a very interesting comparison with computer chess, and I guess also with Deep Blue. So when computers play chess, calculation's much faster, obviously, but they're still going to want to use tables of pre-calculated moves, and Deep Blue did do this. So like I said a little earlier, with pre-calculated moves, you might be facing a human opponent that can blitz out 20 moves in 5 minutes. And the human knows these moves are good moves because they've studied them in preparation for the game. So if you're a computer and you don't rely on a table yourself, you've suddenly put yourself at a time disadvantage because you're wasting a lot of time on the opening moves of the game, which your opponent is only going to be making good moves, at least in theory, anyway. So you want to use tables of pre-calculated moves as well. So this is something that computers will often do. And of course, they're still going to be pruning because it's impossible for them to calculate to any great depth without that. Even Minimax Alpha Beta, it's what Deep Blue used, but it has its own limitations as well, and we'll see what happened when they use Minimax Alpha Beta with Deep Blue. Humans prune moves that are unlikely to be good, so this is forward pruning. And remember, Minimax Alpha Beta isn't forward pruning. Minimax Alpha Beta just refuses to consider moves that are certain not to be good moves. Forward pruning is more concerned with identifying moves that are unlikely to be good and just not considering them, because it's just probably just going to be a waste of time. So, of course, things have sort of advanced since the days of Deep Blue. Top chess engines today include Stockfish and Lila Chess Zero. And the top current player is a Norwegian by the name of Magnus Carlsen. And his current rating is around 2855.4. That fluctuates, of course. And you can see it's far, far below Stockfish and Lila Chess Zero. So at this point, the top engines essentially beat humans all the time, provided they're running on optimal hardware. A human just cannot beat a top chess engine. But now we get to Deep Blue. Deep Blue wasn't like those other engines. Deep Blue was kind of a watershed moment in the history of computer chess. And that's because Deep Blue was kind of the point at which computers began to overtake humans. So you didn't see that big rating gulf that we saw just a minute ago with Stockfish and Lila Chess Zero versus the top humans at the time. Deep Blue was, at the beginning, it was actually inferior to Kasparov, but later it was really able to probably beat him, although it's not certain if it was better or that much better. Deep Blue was done by Carnegie Mellon University and IBM, and it was a fairly long process. It started in 1985, and the first match that they played against Garry Kasparov was in 1996, so that was 11 years later. And then they did some retooling, upgrading, and played a rematch in 1997. But in the 1996 match, Deep Blue won the first game, and Kasparov won the match. So it was a 6-game match. Kasparov won 4-2. In the second match in 1997, Deep Blue won the match, a score of 3.5 to 2.5. And I'd said that it wasn't so certain just how much better Deep Blue was than Kasparov, and this is kind of where you begin to see that point. So Kasparov won by a score of 2 in the first match. Deep Blue only won by a score of 1 in the second match. And what's more, in the second match, the score was really 2.5 to 2.5 going into the last game. So it was really tied. And in the last game, Deep Blue had the white pieces, so it had a slight advantage because the white player moves first. It's not really a winning advantage, but it's a slight advantage. And Kasparov didn't play so well, and Deep Blue won the match by 1 point. Kasparov is very much a prima donna type of person, and he was very unhappy about losing. And he claimed that IBM had cheated against him. He claimed that Deep Blue was making moves that seemed a little too much human-like, or at least not like the computers he was used to working with. And so he figured, maybe there was some sort of foul play involved. And unfortunately, these sorts of allegations come back time and time again in chess, and sometimes they're founded and sometimes they're not. I don't know there's any reason to believe that these allegations were actually true in the case of IBM. But there's a very funny and unfortunate story. So one former chess champion who followed Kasparov and actually beat him was Kramnik, who's another Russian. And he was playing a match against a guy by the name of Topalov, who was also a very good player, and I believe maybe a world champion at one point in his own right as well. And Topalov lost the match, and he claimed cheating against this guy. And he claimed that it involved toilets and like hiding a phone in a toilet or something like that. So it's a kind of funny story, this toilet gate. So you might want to read a little more about that. So that's just a little aside. To this day, they are not friends, unfortunately. So here's Deep Blue. Deep Blue is a supercomputer. It has 2 racks. And each of these racks today is in a different museum. So I guess it's probably not going to run again. So this huge computer had 480 processors and 16 special chips designed by one of the people on the team for chess specifically. So the theory was you just kind of brute force your way through playing chess using Minimax Alpha Beta. So you have your 480 processors, you can do a lot of parallel processing, and that's the idea, sort of. Now, since then, we've gotten more computing power, and we've got better algorithms and better engines. But still, chess engines are sometimes run on high-end hardware. So, for example, in 2017, there was a championship hosted by chess.com, and they used Amazon Web Services to host their engine. So it's not necessarily the case that chess computers are just run on regular desktops anymore, although they are sometimes. And I wanted to find out whether a regular desktop running a high-end chess program could beat a human. I'm fairly certain they could. That you don't need AWS to do it, but I didn't actually find anything about that. So, like I said, I mean, Deep Blue is using Minimax Alpha Beta, and that is why they needed 480 processors, because even though we know that Minimax is incredibly inefficient and the Alpha Beta is a big gain on Minimax, Alpha Beta still has its limitations. And even with those 480 processors, you're going to have to do a lot of calculation doing Minimax Alpha Beta. I didn't see if they actually had a better algorithm, like with improvements on it, and I know that they used some additional help that we'll get to in a minute. Eventually, this computer was capable of 11.38 gigaflops, and it was a fairly powerful supercomputer, but it wasn't, the top supercomputer in the world. And with all these parallel processors, it could search 6 to 20 moves deep. However, this is likely chess moves. So if you remember, we were talking about Minimax, or learning about it several weeks ago. And when we looked at a Minimax tree, we would say, 1 move per level of the tree. But that was a move by either white or by black. In chess, generally, when we say searching so-and-so many moves deep, we're actually saying 1 move consists of both a move by white and a move by black. So that would mean in this case, it would be more like perhaps 12 to 40 moves deep with Deep Blue. It's possible that I'm wrong about this, but generally that's the way chess is thought of. And like I said earlier, a good chess player can calculate 10 moves deep, so and that's regular chess moves. So if this was 6 to 20 not regular chess moves, then what we're really talking about here is 3 to 10 regular chess moves deep, which means you're not really competing with a human anymore, because they can outcompute you. So Deep Blue used books and tables for additional reference for obvious reasons. Like I said earlier, you don't really want to be going up against the best player in the world and waste a bunch of time in the opening. I mean, you need all the time you can get. And yes, these are compiled collections of predetermined possible moves. So kind of to wrap things up, I'm going to show you some positions in the first game that Deep Blue played against Kasparov. So before we just talk about that, I'm going to point out that this is from an article on chess.com, and I'm going to provide the link in a few slides. If you look to the left, of the chessboard, you'll see a vertical white bar. At the bottom of the bar, there's a number, it's 0.8. And this game is actually being analyzed by a modern chess computer. I'm going to guess that it might be Stockfish, but it could also be Komodo, which is an engine that chess.com purchased that's also very powerful. And when a computer these days evaluates a chess game, often what they do is they use the scoring system, where a score of 0 means that the game's essentially equal for white and black. Each of them have a good position. Neither of them really has an advantage over the other player. A positive score is good for white, and a negative score is good for black. Now, generally, if you get to a score of, say, 2 for white, there's a pretty good chance to win the game. And once you get to, say, 4 or more, you pretty much have won the game. Even 3 is often winning. And, of course, analogously for black, -3 or -4 is just an almost overpowering advantage for the black player. Right now, the score is 0.8, which means it's fairly balanced, but it does favor Deep Blue a little bit, because Deep Blue is playing with the white pieces here, and Kasparov is playing with black. Now, Deep Blue has just made a move. It's moved its rook from c1 to c7, and you can see that's highlighted on the board. And Kasparov is about to blunder. So here, Kasparov has moved his rook from g8 to e8. And you'll notice that the evaluation has changed substantially. So the weight bar has risen substantially, and the number is now 5.2. That's up from 0.8. So this is already a winning position for Deep Blue. And often, once you get to a score like this, a good chess player realizes that at this point they've lost the game in most cases. I don't know if Kasparov realized at this instant that he had lost the game or not, but he realized it very soon, and he soon resigned. After several more moves, we got to this position. Deep Blue moved its rook and put black in check, and Kasparov resigned. Now, this position is kind of interesting. So first of all, you'll notice that if it weren't Deep Blue's, if Kasparov weren't in check, with one move, he could checkmate Deep Blue. And that is, he could move his black rook from e1 to h1. That would put the black king in check, there would be no legal moves, and the game would be over. So basically, Deep Blue is facing checkmate in 1, and it needs to stave it off. But as it turns out, Deep Blue isn't really scared. That's because its position is much better. Black's king is very exposed. It's currently in check. Cannot take the rook because it's protected by the knight. Cannot take the knight because it's protected by the queen. So it can only move its king. And Kasparov can only move his king to one legal square. That's to g6. Now, at this point, the computer that's running the analysis hasn't calculated what's called like a mating sequence, which would be a sequence of force moves that leads to guaranteed leads to checkmate. The score is 12, which is an overpowering advantage, but if it were, say, going to be mate in 12, the score would actually be m12. And there's no m in the score right now, so that means that the computer hasn't seen a checkmate sequence yet. But obviously, you can see that black's king is exposed. If he moves his king to g6, white could move his queen to g8 and put him in check again. At this point, he would have to move down to f5, and he would just be dreadfully exposed. This is just a bad position. There's no good way out of it, and so the game's just going to be over. So Kasparov did resign at this point. This was the first game he played against Deep Blue. So if you want to read a little bit more about Deep Blue, there is a book that I consulted called Beyond Deep Blue, Chess in the Stratosphere. This book isn't actually about Deep Blue specifically, although there are plenty of books about Deep Blue specifically. This one starts by talking about Deep Blue, and then it continues and talks about the development of chess engines since then. So that's a worthwhile investigation. The Wikipedia article on Deep Blue is a very good article. I would highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in reading more. I'd say most of the information that I got from these slides came from Wikipedia. And then, of course, the annotated chess game came from this website on chess.com, Kasparov versus Deep Blue, the match that changed chess history. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you haven't ever played chess, I hope you get inspired by this and take the time to learn it. It's a fascinating game, and there are all sorts of videos you can watch. You can watch tournaments online, and of course, studying about chess engines can also be fascinating. So thank you.